Mother Nature is our biggest business partner, and there is no negotiating with her. Absolutely no negotiating with her.
Welcome to Oysterology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host, Kevin Cox. The first I heard of my guest, Nicolette Mariano, was in a short video clip of her donning a mask and snorkel and diving for oysters. Unlike so many oyster farmers who work from a boat or wade into thigh-deep waters to tend their crop, Nicolette had to actually work underwater to set, clean, sort, and manage her young oyster farm, Treasure Coast Shellfish, in Sebastian, Florida. As if that wasn't hard enough, she did it alone as a tiny upstart operation which she started on the front end of COVID. It was a dream she had been hatching for years while learning about aquaculture and working with other oyster producers. So I went to Florida to get the story straight from Nicolette, and when I got to her farm on the sparkling waters of the Indian River Lagoon, I was surprised to see not a lonely woman jostling and heaving heavy mesh bags filled with oysters from the water to the side of the boat, but rather a full-fledged oyster farm, complete with floating gear, a processing barge and a boat, and a small crew of people who clearly enjoyed their work. With a background in marine science and a commitment to environmental preservation, Nicolette launched her tiny company with the goal of producing high-quality oysters while giving back to the ecosystem. Today, she embodies the idea that one person can start with a solo grassroots dream and transform it into something that makes a difference, and in her case, establishes the east coast of Florida, with only 3 oyster farms, as an excellent oyster region. At Treasure Coast Shellfish, the focus is on clean, sustainable farming of a product which embraces the history of the place while cleaning the water and creating new habitat. Through her sustainable practices, Nicolette has made Treasure Coast Shellfish more than just an oyster farm, but a community-oriented enterprise dedicated to protecting marine habitats and promoting responsible aquaculture. Her leadership has made the company a pioneer in environmentally conscious oyster production on Florida's East Coast, and her efforts are inspiring a whole new generation of aquaculturists. I joined the Treasure Coast Shellfish crew of Cody, Desiree, and Brent out on the lease that morning, where they harvested, sorted, and even shucked with a paint scraper oysters for that day's orders. Then I sat down with Nicolette where I discussed a range of other topics, including land farming versus aqua farming, getting stuck deep in the mud in mangroves, oyster mortality, ignorant boaters driving through oyster farms, the challenges of getting seed, and the real cost of oyster farming with my guest, Nicolette Mariano. Hi, Nicolette. Thank you so much for being on Oysterology today. We are in Sebastian, Florida, which is where you have Treasure Coast Shellfish Company. And I had the great pleasure of going out this morning with your crew onto the lease, and it was fantastic. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into this world of oysters.
Yeah, I'm a Floridian, born and raised down in Stuart, Florida, so just south of here, and went to college at Florida Tech in Melbourne, about 20, 30 minutes north of where we are right now. I found out about aquaculture when I was 14 during the '04 and '05 hurricanes, when those 2 years just merged together with Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Gene.
Which was such an unusual thing, right?
Yeah,
You really are at the mercy of the weather. I mean, you're at the mercy of the weather to go out and harvest and do the work of farming, but much more so than that with hurricanes. Do you worry all the time?
yes. Mother Nature is our biggest business partner, and there is no negotiating with her. Absolutely no negotiating with her. I mean, like, oh, we have this plan, what we're going to get done this week, and then a front comes through and, oh, we got gusts up to 30, 40 knots, pulling a cage up on the side of the boat. Someone's going to squish their fingers, or, it's not safe. And we're in that wider part of the lagoon, too, so we're not protected by anything out there.
The lagoon is the Indian River Lagoon, which is gigantic.
Yes, the Indian River actually encompasses 1/3 of the entire east coast of Florida. And then Florida's pretty big. The Indian River is one of the most biodiverse estuaries in North America. And where we're located, we're just south of the Sebastian Inlet and north of Pelican National Wildlife Refuge. And Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge is the first wildlife refuge in the United States.
And was it because of pelicans, hence the name, or?
Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah. when you think about what Roosevelt did around the country, I mean, preserving national parks and all of this was incredible.
Yeah.
So the Indian River Lagoon, it's not like a river. I mean, it's got islands and barrier islands. And
It's a brackish water estuary, and an estuary is essentially a nursery from everything from your marine mammal to your fish, crabs, bull sharks come in and pups in the Indian River.
really, bull shark pups, is that what they call them? That's
Yeah.
puppies that'll take your hand off if you pet them too much, I guess.
Yeah. Oysters are very cute. They're Mother Nature's razor blades.
So tell me a little bit about your background and how it led to aquaculture and what you did before you started Treasure Coast.
Yeah. So growing up in Stewart, I feel like any kid growing up in Florida that likes to be outside and in and on the water, wants to do something with the environment and be that marine biologist that specializes in dolphins and paints on the side. And then the hurricanes in '04 and '05, I just started volunteer orientation at the Florida Oceanographics. And then whichever storm came first, the following week I didn't get to volunteer because there was a hurricane. And down the back was a destroyed shellfish hatchery. And I was 14 and went to clean up the nature trail. And I just kind of kept going back, asking questions. I had no idea at the time what it was. And I was pulling out a tank out of the mangroves and I sunk up to my waist in muck, and that's when I thought, I know it wasn't quicksand, but that far deep. It took 4 grown men to pull me out.
I can't imagine the sense of panic that you must have felt when you realized, I can't get out of here. What am I going to do now?
I've never experienced anything like that. As far as like getting stuck in something where you can't get yourself out of. But yeah, and ironically enough, fast forward, I think probably my sophomore or junior year in college, I was doing some lab work with lionfish, and somebody was talking, and I heard them talk about Florida Oceanographics. And he was one of those guys that pulled me out.
Did he say, like, you were that kid?
Honestly, I don't even remember how they got me out. Wow. Probably like a pull or something.
Yeah. Did you have any experience doing it beforehand so you had a clue what you were getting yourself into?
Yeah. My first job out of college was working with the town of Barnstable in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. We did shellfish stock enhancement for recreational shellfish and commercial shellfish. And then also fortunate enough to do shellfish enforcement as well. So checking people's rec and commercial tech baskets and catch limits and things.
So you were up there learning about that. On your path toward Treasure Coast shellfish, what was your next step after that?
It was my first job in aquaculture.
And you decided to come back down here? Was it just like, I think I'm going to do this myself, but I'm going to do it in Florida? Or how did that happen?
I'll give you the big Cliff Notes version. So then after that, I was applying for jobs. I interviewed for a hatchery tech position. I worked up in Maine. I worked in the hatchery. I did some algae culture with the larvae and the babies. And then because up in Maine and New England, it's seasonal. You're not going to be spawning. Nobody's going to want seed in the middle of winter when there's like a couple inches of ice.
Right.
Nothing's going to grow. So then I got to go out and work in the flupsies that they had. Then I also worked out on the farm and the processing facility.
So before you started your own oyster farm, you had some exposure to sort of all aspects of oyster aquaculture, from the hatchery and dealing with the microscopic larvae and growing them. And did you deal with developing algae, nutrient water, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
When you started the farm here, you were rack and bag on the bottom. Describe what rack and bag is.
So rack and bag is actually an intertidal method. So it would be exposed during low tide.
Right.
That I was using in a subtidal area, where subtidal is it won't be exposed during low tide.
Oh, that's it. So an intertidal method in a subtidal environment.
That was pretty much just to stay in the regulations and compliance of the bottomless. And that was to really get something out there to do R&D.
How many racks did you have, and how many bags do they hold, or did they hold when you started?
Well, it started with one and a 10-foot pieces of rebar got from Home Depot.
So
I think about 40-ish. So 40-ish racks and 6 bags set to a rack.
What size seed do you usually put in the water?
We'd prefer to get 6 mil seed, but with Florida regulation, It's hard to get 6 millimeter seed from out of state because Florida has a zero tolerance policy for pathogens.
I want to visualize what it was like for you at the very beginning when you had rack and bag down on the bottom. About how deep is the water where you were doing that?
About 5 feet.
Okay, and how tall are you? 5'4"?
Fish, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you do it?
Like a crazy person, I threw the bags on a hurricane. And it literally, like, the side of the boat was maybe 4 inches from the water. So I could easily push the bags up onto that boat versus, like, the Carolina skiff, how high the gunnels are on there. And, yeah, and my first crop was September 19 that I planted. And very quickly, I think it was probably about within the first 5 months, and it was warming up, I started noticing boring sponge. And boring sponge is just the sponge that bores through the shell. You know, they're shucked an oyster and it just kind of crumbles.
Yeah.
That's boring sponge. And oysters naturally set in that intertidal area, so they're exposed during both low tides a day, which will knock back predators, pests, and boring sponge. And boring sponge is a sea sponge that needs to be wet.
So when the tide is down and the oysters are exposed to air, the sea sponges will die or they won't come there in the first place.
They won't. And that's how I called, and I was like, hey, do you think I could go put these oysters laying out on the dock? Because basically, if not, the boring sponge is going to take over.
But to put these bags down on your racks, you had to dive down under the water to do that because it's deep for you. You couldn't stand there and just set them. So how did you do that?
I would toss the bags off, anchor the boat, and then I'd also, as more racks got out there, I'd have a stern rope because the current would change or the tide. So then I would tie that stern rope to a rack. Part of that reason was because people don't know what a dive flag be. So I literally would have the boat almost over top of me. So people wouldn't come. So I would go, I'd throw the bag down, I'd lay them. There was a certain way to go. Then they get bungeed underneath to the bag or to the rack. And just a lot of up and down, holding your breath.
So you'd go up to the site where you want to leave these bags and just dump all of the bags over the side into a random pile, and then you'd dive down.
Not just a random pile, so it depended like where the racks were, where they were spaces. One rack might be here, the next might be 10 feet away. So I would drive around and I'd toss roughly where I thought they were. I had 4 floats on the edges of where the outer racks were, so I'd kind of like eyeball it. Or I would lay them on the side. Again, the hurricane was low, or I'd lay them kind of halfway hanging over, and I'd pull them off, and then I'd use that stern rope and move around to where I want to do, let more anchor.
And you were doing this alone, right? You were out in the water alone with a boat stacked high with bags of oysters, a dive flag floating there, and you were using a mask and snorkel or scuba, or what were you doing?
Yep. Started out with mask and fins.
Wow.
Mask and fins, and then it turned into more racks and more bags. Then started using a third lung air compressor or hookah.
Oh, that's good. So you don't have to worry about filling tanks and running out and having down.
Yeah. And then also, again, with dive tanks, you're going to have a BC on the regulators and stuff. And I'd be under the water sometimes for 2-3 hours straight.
Did you wear a weight belt to help stay down there?
At that time I did, yeah. Or sometimes, well, during winter with a wetsuit, I'd have 2 on. But because on the surface, the oysters were moving around in the bags and the cages, hitting up against each other, chipping that growth edge, creating hopefully a nice deep cup. They're just in a bag near the bottom. Nothing's moving them. So to get that cup shape, that's where and why I'd be underwater. Physically shaking these bags. Also down there brushing like the algae on the bags sometimes. With a peanut wood handle brush like a cray first.
I don't know all the different techniques of oyster farming, but that is very possibly the most difficult technique, right? Because my God, you got to take them down there. You got to lash them down there. Then you got to maintain them by shaking them around so you can get some nice deep cups and clip off those little fingernails.
Again, intertidal method and a subtidal area. And that was the only way I could get something out there and to stay within Florida regulations while researching and looking at to do water columns.
Yeah, sure. That was your plan all along.
Yeah, that was, no, the rack and bag, definitely not. sustainable.
The biofoul, I would think, would have been a major problem because it's never getting exposed to the air. So you've got to, scrub it off? Or
It was mainly the boring farms. So I was working them enough. I was at least shaking those bags once a week. And then in the beginning, it was more because there wasn't that many bags or that many racks. The things weren't setting. Just like a boat. If your boat keeps moving, stuff's not going to grow on
your
it.
bottom's not going to get as fouled. So how did your oysters come out when you were doing it rack and bag like that? And just by brute force, shaking them, keeping them moving, defouling them?
They were good. They had a nice shape to them.
You got good deep cups and all of that?
Yeah.
You don't have a hatchery here at Treasure Coast, right?
No. I would love to, because that's where it all starts.
So where do you get your seed then?
We've been fortunate enough to work with a hatchery in Virginia. With Florida, there aren't a lot of oyster hatcheries, and we're on the East Coast.
Right.
And we're one of 3 farms. And oysters, whether they're diploid, oysters that reproduce, or triploids, oysters that don't reproduce, they cannot go from the Atlantic to the Gulf in Florida. Triploids can go from the Gulf to the Atlantic. In part, genetics they're worried about, but primarily the chances of spreading some different diseases that have been present at some point on the East Coast. We should be focused more on, well, why can't we get oyster seeds from the Atlantic to the Gulf? If you test the oyster seed, or even larvae, when they're like not even a month old, in a self-contained recirculated system in a hatchery, and then get them like pathology tested, like that's very young. There's no chance of them really getting disease.
There are hatcheries in Hawaii that are sending, seed to Washington State and maybe even all the way over to the East Coast. I don't know.
Kona, yeah. I visited that area. I was like, what? And I can't even just get seed, and we're connected over here.
It does. There aren't that many seed producers in the United States, really, that are producing large-scale seed to sell to other farmers.
Oh, there are. Oyster Sea Holding, we have been very fortunate to work with them. From the beginning, I knew I wanted to use like local broodstock parent oysters to our growing area. It just makes sense, like using parent oysters from our growing area naturally to then create babies. Because, to be able to give back to the environment. I mean, diploids spawn, then they set all over your gear and other oysters, and it's a pain in the butt. But to be giving back to the lagoon. So from the beginning, I knew that I wanted and needed and should do that. And they're doing really good, the diploids and the triploids.
So I did notice on your dock, you had upwellers along the one side.
So that's a private aquaculture dock that
Right.
we're renting and in an agreement on with the owners. And then also the lease. It's a special dock. It's also zoned as an aquaculture lease, but it's a permanently closed area. You can't harvest from there. But
It sounds like you have a pretty nice kind of coexisting relationship together. I mean, you're sharing the dock. Do you get along with them?
But yeah, I mean, that's the industry here. That's it. It's just us. So yeah, we do really cohabitate and work well, in the same space. I mean, I got lucky with the lease I have. I proposed to the state a rectangle, so like setting up floating cages wasn't the greatest, but that's all zoned as bottom lease, so you can only use 6 inches off the bottom. And I understand it from a regulatory standpoint, but I mean, before even the rack and bags, when I installed those, it was like desolate. It was a desert with the tumbleweed going by, and that was underwater. And it's creating an ecosystem.
Yeah, by putting things on the bottom like that, you're going to actually be enhancing it.
Yeah, different species and aquatic vegetation or plants like encroach because you got a bunch of oysters that are filtering the water with their feces and pseudofeces, essentially like fertilizer.
And all of a sudden you have a whole new environment.
Yeah. And that's what's great with the floating gear. It creates that vertical three-dimensional habitat.
When you have floating cages like what you've got that aren't actually touching the bottom, does this new ecosystem develop as quickly, or is it a slower process?
So I think even if we just started originally with floating cages, it probably would have been the same as the bottom tier.
Yeah.
I grew up on this river. I had never seen a live face scallop in the Indian River in my entire life until 2 years ago. And every year there's been a different species that has been like recruiting. Last summer was seahorses. And one stone crab, we called him Mr. Stony.
Mr. Stoney.
Mr. Stony the stone crab.
Do you know if Mr. Stoney's still hanging around?
No, I think one of those windstorms or squalls, I think covered it up in it. That crab went around.
Yeah. So you had your rack and bags on the bottom, and then you got your permits finally. And what do you call the way you grow them now? In the
Floating gear.
It's just floating gear.
Yep, the cages are floating cages. That's floating gear. Or so that's a water column lease. So you're using the water column instead of the bottom, which is for Florida. That
Right.
is off the bottom. Even at the dock is floating. Those the pods you saw there get power washed in the back.
Yeah,
The floating,
right.
That's floating gear. So I used the floating bags out there because we needed more space.
Yeah.
Wasn't in that position to be able to get more cages.
Those cages look expensive. What does a typical cage like that cost when you buy it new?
Oh, everything's gone up on metal, plastic. I mean, COVID, prices went through the roof. When I started, I think one bag was like $5. And they're like the flat bags that would box out. I think they're like $7 or $8 last time.
Yeah.
And then you got to build them out.
Right.
The infrastructure, that's another thing, the infrastructure is a lot. So I think right now it's probably like $215 per cage.
Wow,
But,
that's a
pricing.
big investment. And you got to grow a lot of oysters to get that back and then make a
Oh, yeah.
profit.
Yeah, between the infrastructure and the gear and labor costs. I mean, our boat is our tractor, maintaining the boats and the engines and everything else. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, that's really expensive for an oyster. It's not like wild harvest. You're not going out with a boat and tonging or picking them up. We are taking care of these oysters from the time they're like the size of your pinky nail, which is about 6 millimeters, like skull size, or even smaller, like 1 millimeter, the size of a pinhead. And we're fortunate that we can get market product within 8 to 18 months down here. Some areas, in Maine in the Northeast, and then even Canada, I mean, it's 3 to 5 years. It's about 5 to 6 years in Alaska.
Because the water's just so cold as opposed to here where there's a lot of algae in the water, a lot of
Year
food.
round.
Right, year round. So how many floating cages do you have now?
There is 420 out there right now. Our main line is 150 feet and 14 cages fit on one line.
I
and
see.
one cage fits 4 bags. So I think that's 56 bags per line.
And you have 14 of those.
Yes.
That's a lot of oysters.
And someone's going to drive through it with a boat due to lack of knowledge.
Do you have a lot of problems with people driving over your lease or doing other nasty things to them?
Yes. We're the only ones out there.
Right. So it's not like they say, oh, lots of oyster farms out here, be careful.
I've tried to work with different entities, agencies, if you will, to get educational signage at boat ramps. Cedar Key's done a wonderful job with their signs, and it could be like plug and play almost with the design and just put in different information, local information for that area. And they're removable, so it's not like you have like a permanent sign and then something's outdated and change it. But people need to know. A lot of people don't know what it is. Even our regulatory agencies, I mean, again, we are the only one. I mean, 4th of July, at the end of the dock, there's clam bags there, that's the lease. So there's the 4th of July parade going on, we're working, and the sheriff's boat goes right through where the clam bags are, like
The sheriff's boat.
3 feet off the dock.
They're not thinking about these leases.
And just like anybody out there, like, most of the people who asked about stuff are from Canada, the Northeast, other countries that have seen aquaculture. Before we were on the dock, every day going out, launching the boat. Oh, what'd you catch? Did you guys have a good day of fishing? Oh, are those crab pots? What do you got in the bags? It's just the lack of knowledge. But I mean, we're it until New Smyrna.
Why do you think that there aren't more oyster farms along here?
It was very prolific with clam farmers. It was filled back in the day, and I was told kind of in the early 2000s, productivity and survivorship wasn't doing as great for the hard clams, and then back to back, those '04 and '05 hurricanes. Pretty much like the last couple of years, like the Gulf just hitting back to back. I mean, whether you're an established company or especially if you're starting out and you bootstrapping it or took loans out or refinance something or took out on your house.
It's a big investment when you talk about just the cost of just the gear itself, but then you add the labor onto it, and you've got a big lease. What's the total size of your lease right now?
The survey I like to go with is 6.665
Acres.
Yeah, so I had to get the lease resurveyed prior, and it comes back like, oh, it's 6.66 acres. I'm like, can we just bump it down to 6.64? Like, I'm not superstitious, but with everything going, I'm just like, oh gosh. So just under 7 acres, and we're using about 33% of it.
So you've got a lot of gear in the water in a pretty big space. When I first learned about you and your operation, I did a little research trying to find out about it, and it was from 4 years ago or something like that, when you were still kind of getting started and figuring it out and doing rack and back.
Yeah.
Then when I talked to you, and then especially today when I went out to your lease, it was like, oh my God. I mean, you have grown this thing. It's remarkable what you've
It's
done.
scary too. If you're a
How
little
did
too
you do it
fast,
so
people are-
fast?
I don't look. Like every year there's just been like a couple people, a couple things, somebody helping, somebody in the beginning giving gear, giving time. I mean, and then during, as we've grown, so I think it was 22. I have to look back. I'm like, I can't do this by myself.
Yeah.
And then in a few months, like, why you don't have more product? And things weren't growing, and I'm like, and did what I needed to do, sold some of my personal stuff, put personal money back into the business, then went through those 7 months, and then in 23, got on with a couple other wholesalers, and we were shipping a lot of stuff to Georgia. I swear at the time the crew was going to have a mutiny on me, because we were working 5 days a week, and then Sunday, we were going out at sunrise. Like right now it's 6:30 because the sun's just coming up. Once it's lighter, it'll be 6.
Yeah.
We were going out and harvesting, and I'm like, we just have to harvest. We got to do, because time and temperature, at that time, it's 11. We couldn't do 10,000. So we're doing about half of our orders on Sunday, and everyone was done by about 12 or 1. And then the other half on Monday to meet the trucks on Monday. We had stuff going to Georgia that day on Monday. I think we had stuff going out to Alabama too. We were working with a wholesaler at the time out there. And so that's the other thing is like stuff that was going out to Alabama. If it didn't get on that truck that day, we were done that week. It had to go out that day. Then just learning like these freight routes and stuff. And it's hard to just start from the beginning. Like I can't get pretty much almost any of these third-party refrigerated freight companies to give me a quote.
Really? Is it because
Phone
they're
calls,
just so busy,
emails.
too full, or?
Small peener.
Yeah, small beans.
Hey, well, what do you want to move? Oh, like 20 bags of oysters.
Yeah.
What's the pallet? I think that's part of it.
So I am trying to picture how you do it. How big is your crew right now?
About 5 people.
Did you have a high mortality rate, or was it kind of whatever the average would be?
It's pretty like typical,
Yeah, what is
mortality. Yeah, a few here, a few there. It's one of those things that you don't know. Because when you hear mortality, wholesalers, restaurants, something's wrong, someone's going to get sick.
Right.
You know how many cows died last year from heat stroke?
Mortality is a natural part of any kind of farming.
It happens in your garden. Anyone who's at least tried to grow cucumbers at some point, I've had like white fly or some type of an issue. Yeah. But the whole triploid mortality, it's devastating. I mean, our 2022 crop was stressed out their entire lives. We didn't have a lot of rain. There wasn't really any algae in the water. So they starved for 5 to 6 months. Then they got shaken around for about a month between Hurricane Ian and Nicole. But now there's food in the water, where we got seed in like maybe June and July. Now it's September and finally. And then, the water's getting cooler in winter. And then hurricane for the next summer. And then 23, there was record-breaking land temperatures. I mean, our logger out there hit 92. I was the highest, and I think the salinity at one point hit 37.
Wow. So hot and
So
salty.
we had mortality in our diploids and triploids, but primarily the triploids.
Do you deal primarily with wholesalers or direct to consumer? What kind of ordering processes?
We do all of it. We
All
do
of it.
retail, wholesale, do wholesalers, wholesale direct to restaurants. In the beginning, I did direct restaurants because I was driving either to New Smyrna or Tampa to get the oysters processed before we became a certified processing facility. I was literally driving 3 or 4 hours in one direction to get them processed.
So a day in the life for you involves managing your crew, telling them what you need, making sure it's getting done right, making sure the product is up to the standards that you're setting.
Taking orders, trying to do social media, responding to emails, retail, all the back end of running a business, office work or paperwork, payroll, bills, all that. What's that called?
Do you ever sleep?
Rarely. I need it though. I do need sleep. I'm one of those people that their brain just starts going, and it's hard for it to shut off. I've always been like a high stress kind of individual.
And plus, in addition to the pier and the barge and the lease out there, we're sitting in this office processing facility, which is filled with gear and your amazing walk-in cooler. So you've got to maintain gear too, right?
Yeah, the gear, making the bags, fixing the lines, the cages, like the cage out there had to swap out the float, add a hole in it, so it's a lot. It is a farm. It's a farm that's on the water, and you got to till your crop, you got to trim the soil, you got to change out spark plugs and the oil and the tractor and, the tires and different things. And it's the same, it's just different. Our tools are different, our methods are different. Here, typical land farmer.
I find the notion of oyster farming and doing what you do to be this beautiful thing that's really interesting and great for the environment, but the details are daunting. I mean, when I look at what you're doing and hear you talk about it, it's like, holy shit, this is a lot.
Yeah, I can't believe where Treasure Coast Shellfish is in just like 4 years.
So how is business? Do you have a range of production that you aim for every year, and are you able to hit those targets?
So I have nothing to compare it to because
Right.
I started with COVID. My first crop was ready in April-ish, and all the restaurants closed in June. And so
You kind of beat all the odds on this thing. It's pretty crazy. So you didn't know how big you should be or needed to be or could possibly be because COVID and just never having done this and nobody else here doing it.
yeah, it's just kind of, and then the whole thing of like getting a southern oyster into the market. Yes, we're in Florida, but the further south you go, the further north you go. And a lot of people, your seasonal people, they come down from New England.
Right.
Especially on the East Coast. So a similar flavor profile, I felt like would go a long way trying to get it into the market, knocking on those doors. And, the historic of Florida oyster is wild Appalachian, 3 larger inch oyster. That's the Florida oyster. So that's the mentality. And then, knocking, going in the back doors of restaurants with the 2.5 inch oyster, and the chefs, the owners looking at you like, what the heck is that all thing? Until you shuck it open, and then the meat basically goes to the edge. You can get a 3 inch oyster with like 2 inches of meat in it. That's where we came up with our Treasure Coast oyster. Same great flavor, just a different shape. And that's a different size range and a larger size range of 2.5 to 3.5 inches.
How many different oyster sizes or types do you sell?
Yeah, we have 3 main brands, just over our Treasure Coast oyster. Right. And then what we started with is our Sebastian Silver, the Plana Petite, 2.5 inches to 2 3/4 inches.
Right.
Because your typical petite is 2 inches. I never heard of a petite until I lived up north. You don't really hear about petite in the South. So.
They're so small by Southern standards, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then our Gold of Blooms is 3 inches and larger. So, and all that is a play off of this historical significance of the Treasure Coast and the 1715 treasure fleet that sunk off of our coast. So
Yeah, so right, this is a big shipwreck area historically. So how would you describe the flavor profile of your oysters?
pretty much the gold doubloons typically are, I say like they're pretty briny all the way through. And then the Sebastian silvers are smaller oysters. They're briny up front with a little bit of a sweeter finish typically.
Yeah, I found it was kind of a little kiss on the cheek by the ocean when you first take that slurp, and then I got sweetness and kind of a fresh mushroomy finish, a little umami. They were really good.
I feel like their flavor profile is a little more complex during the winter months because they're feeding on different algae and sometimes like different diatoms too versus the summer.
Yeah. What would you say is your least favorite part? I mean, even the best job in the world has things about it
The
that suck.
administration with work. Yeah, I think a lot of people get into business because it's something that they enjoy to do. And then they start their own business, and then it starts to grow, and then you're stuck in the office more doing all the things you don't want to be doing.
So there's a lot of time in kind of business development as well as all the other administrative tasks that you get to play with all the time.
You know, I never wanted to be in a cubicle. I never wanted to be in an office, and you know that's where I'm needed right now as the business is growing. And
What
then,
percentage
hopefully
of
we'll-
time do you spend in the office versus out on the pier or on the barge or somewhere?
Unfortunately, most of it now.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of speaking engagements and you're getting around in the broader industry. Is that something that you want to do more of?
Yeah. I say that like hesitantly because I mean 24/7 for 4 years. I'll be honest, I'm tired. And then again, it is the growing pains too. It's like
Sure.
this is my baby. I literally started this by myself, no help. I mean, I've been out there by myself struggling, trying to harvest stuff with the cages and wind blowing. People can come in, something happened, whatever, but you got to get it done.
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
The main goal is to still be in business. I'm waiting for seed. You know, there's that whole aspect of the need for seed, especially in the South. We're dependent on some northern hatcheries, and they're not producing. They slow down. They shut down, like me.
I don't know how you do it, Nicolette. I will say that the proof is in the pudding, and some of your crew shucked a few oysters for me out there today, and they were sensational.
You know, you got a good oyster when the farmer knows how to strike it with a paint scraper.
I'm so glad you said that because I forgot. I have never seen anybody shuck an oyster with a paint scraper, but he did it better than I do it with a really nice little shucking knife.
I know sometimes I'm like with my like, dog fur knife, and I'm like, I just want to use a paint scraper right now.
Well, Nicolette, congratulations on everything you're doing, and you're amazing, and your farm is amazing, and I can't wait to eat more of your oysters. So,
Yeah. Thank you for coming out with us today, Tyler.
well, that's it for this episode of Oysterology. Thanks to my guest, Nicolette Mariano. As always, show notes can be found on this episode's page, and if you enjoyed it, please rate or review it on whatever podcast platform you listen on. I'm your host, Kevin Cox. Join me next week when we pry open the shell of another interesting oysterology topic.